Collars come in many different shapes and sizes. This can be dictated by fashion trend or the function of the garment. However, no matter how diverse the selection of collars may seem, they fit very neatly within 4 different categories. These are flat collars, stand collars, those that are an integral part of the garment, meaning they're not separate, and the collar and revere. All of these different collar types, however, have one thing in common. That is, they all start from the toile. We need to make sure that as a designer, we are happy with the fit of the toile before we can proceed with the collar, because it is from the pattern of this toile that we will create the pattern for our collar. This video will focus on stand collar types. We will have a specific focus on that of a shirt collar, which has a 2-piece separate stand and collar. We will talk through pattern drafting and basic construction. In this section of the video, we're going to talk about the basic principles of drafting and constructing a traditional shirt collar 2-piece with a separate stand and collar section. I'm using the Winifred Aldridge book, Metric Pattern Cutting, for your reference as a guide, and we are looking at number 9, which is our shirt collar. It doesn't really matter what edition you have, because the basic principles of drafting the collars inside the books are exactly the same. So we have established earlier on in the video that we are happy with our toile. We are happy with the way it fits around the neck and the body shape, as it is the pattern of that toile we will be using to produce the collar pattern. So it really doesn't make sense to progress to the collar if we are not happy with the actual body pattern. So to produce this sort of collar, the first things you will need are the measurements of the neck edge of your shirt. Now, things to consider are our centre front point. As you can see here on the collar, when this top button is done up, this is our centre front line, and the collar does not come past that centre front. But the stand of the collar comes to the folded edge of our facing. So our facing folds back, but the collar comes to that edge. So these points are critical on our pattern when we draft, to make sure we're sure where they are. So I have my centre front line here. I have my fold line for where the facing goes back. So I've measured the distance between my centre front and my fold line is 1.3 centimetres, and my front neck edge is 10.3. Now, when we are measuring on a curve, to get a far more accurate measurement, the best way to do this is with your tape measure on its edge, so you can run it around the curve to get an accurate measurement. It's far better than when the tape is flat and you're trying to walk it around. So any curve, we'll put our tape measure on its edge. I've also measured my back neck, but these are finished measurements, so this is not including any seam allowance. This is just the finished measurements. And the first thing when drafting that we're asked to do for a shirt collar is that we're putting in our baseline as a start. So this, I have just drawn a straight line on my piece of paper, and then I have squared up another line just at a random length at the moment. So these will be at 90 degrees, and this would be my point 1. Now 1 to 2 is equal to my half neck measurement. Well, this pattern here is only half of my neck, because this is one side of the garment. So it is the measurement I have here that they're asking for. It's not about halving this, which is a common error. This is actually half of my neck, so it is this measurement. So I am going to measure from my center front to my center back, and that is what 1 to 2 would be. So I know my back neck is 11.1. So I can place my square on there, and I can go 11.1. And I know my front neck there is 10.3. So I can move that across and go 10.3. So I'm not even having to worry about adding the two together, just working them separately. Next is 1 to 3. And if we look in the book here, 1 to 3 is equal to a collar, stand, and depth measurement, square across. So here's where we are. So we're looking for the depth of our stand and our collar. So these are design features. And what we know is that our collar depth here usually would hide the stand. So if we look at our sample here, if we turn it around, we can see the stand is hidden underneath the collar. So we would know that the collar is deeper than the stand. So if we want something as a guide, just for our first sample, our first toile, we could always measure a collar, toile this, and see if it's sort of the shape you're after. So this finished measurement of stand is 2 centimeters, and our finished collar depth is 4.7. So together that would be 6.7. So that would be my 0.3 would be 6.7. But as I say, these are design features, so these are up to you. And I'm also going to separate that because I know that I will need 0.2 there for my stand. So all we do is follow these across, and you can see we create the rectangle and the shape of our collar. So 1 to 4 is 3/4 of our 1 to 2. Okay, so if you are not sure how to work out your quarters, we can always use our square. Now this square has inches and centimeters on it, but I can put my center line on here and see where I meet the center, and then I can do the same again to get my quarter point. So that is 0.4, and that's without having to worry about working out any maths. But if you're concerned, a great thing is that you calculate it on your mobile phone. So you've got nothing to worry about there. So here we are joining up our shapes. We will also be joining to 0.2. So you can see we're creating our rectangular shape now for our collar. Then when we create our points, again, personal choice, this is a design feature. But the tighter the angle, the more difficult it is to turn these seam allowances through. So a wider angle makes that much easier to turn through. But it could be that you are dictated to the shape here to whatever trend is fashionable at the moment when you are looking to design your collar. So these are very personal choices to make. And our collar stand that it asks for is our measurement that we have here on the fold. Now again, this can be individual to your pattern and to your style, but it's understanding where these measurements come from that help you create your draft. Then once you have your draft, this collar and stand are all in one. But if you follow the stages along on the book, so we then here, to create the separate stand, we divide and we trace them off. And then you end up with our separate pieces. So we're creating this shape, and it creates, we take away the centerpiece here, like a little bit piece of a dart suppression again, which helps when we fold our collar over in creating the curve to go around the neck. So that's the basics of drafting our collar, and really it is just by following step by step the instructions in the book, which is the same for any draft. It's just like creating your own dot to dot and then drawing the lines in. So once we've drafted our collar, we would then trace the pattern pieces off and add our seam allowance. So we have our under collar and we have our stand. Now we would have, if we look at our sample here, an inside and outside stand. So we would be cutting a pair of stands, and we have a top collar and an under collar. And just like in the other video, as we discussed, the areas that are more visible would be those that would also be interfaced to give your collar body and structure and nice, clean, sharp edges. Also, depending on the fabric, maybe you'd find that your stand might be interfaced on the inside and outside stand to make sure your collar stand stands upright and doesn't collapse. All these considerations and the weight of the interfacing would depend on your base fabric. So once you've traced it around and got your under collar, as we did with the flat collar, we make sure our top collar is a couple of mil wider to allow for our seam roll, because we're always looking that the seam rolls to the underside and is not seen on the right side. So we are at the neck edge at our points, we could keep that as 0, extending then to 2 mil at the widest point and then coming back in. So that helps that roll. The thicker your fabric, the deeper the allowance would be needed to create that roll. So I then have a top collar, an under collar and a stand. And depending on your fabric type, of course, would depend if you block fuse or not. To go over block fusing again, we are talking about a rectangular shape, a block shape of fabric that is already interfaced. It is large enough for our pattern pieces to go on. We can trace it around them and cut them out. This keeps the shape that you're after. There's no way we can then have any distortion because we have fused the fabric first. Definitely recommended if you have any curved edges, but it does make life a lot easier and keeps your work far more stable if you block fuse. So here I've got my inside and outside stand. I've decided to fuse them both, and then it would be my top collar piece, because that is the piece that is more visible when worn, that I want to look nice and crisp and sharp. So if we talk through some basic construction of our collar, the first thing we would do is put our two collar pieces together. So here I've just put right sides, the face side of the fabric together, and I have stitched my centimetre seam allowance, bringing these edges together, even allowing for the top collar being wider, and continued around the three sides, leaving this edge open because we want to turn the collar through. I've cut away and reduced as much bulk in the corner as possible, because when we're turning through, we don't want all that thick seam allowance interfering with the sharpness of the point of our collar. So we cut the point off first and then into the corners to remove as much bulk as we can. Then I've also layered the seam allowance here. So the seam allowance that is underneath is narrower than the seam allowance that is on the top. This graduates the seam allowance in the collar and doesn't leave a harsh edge. So that's our starting point, is producing the actual collar piece trimming. Then we would turn it through and press. The next stage then would be our stands. So we would have two stands, an inside and an outside stand. So the inside stand, which is this one here, I have prepped this edge here. Now this outer edge here is the one that goes onto my garment. This top edge here is the one that attaches to the collar. Now on my pattern pieces, it's important that you mark those so you know. So you can see I've written collar attach, garment attach, and likewise on my collars, I've also written stand attach. So hopefully we're not going to put them on upside down. Okay, so it's a good thing to annotate your patterns so you make sure you've got them the right way around. So on my inside stand, I have folded up 8mm. Even though I have a centimetre seam allowance, I'm just going to fold this up 8mm to give myself a little bit more of an allowance when I actually attach it to the garment. That allowance will become evident later on. So I folded that up, and you have to make sure that you fold the same depth up and you're parallel all the way along and don't run off to nothing at the point. It will mean you'll get a couple of little pleats, but that's fine because they are hidden. And this is sort of just a preparation for a process further down the line of your inside stand. Then on your collar, you can see where I've turned this through, that the seam has rolled there to the underside, and then this is my top collar. So I've attached my outside stand. You can see I've actually written on here my under collar and outside stand I've attached together. So I've done this as a prep stage. So I've only taken a 5mm seam allowance, and you can see I had notches on my pattern piece here to know where my collar should end, because that's my center front point. So I don't want to come round this curve, and there at the other side it's ended at the same point. And if you fold them in half, these should measure the same. Likewise, if you check your collar, the lengths of your collar points should also be the same. So once you have attached your outside stand, you can then place your inside stand on top and sandwich the collar in between. So that's what I've done here. I've sandwiched the collar in between the two, taking my centimetre seam allowance all the way around. You can see we have the step here. This is compensating for what we've already folded back on our inside stand. So again, we have a convex curve here. So we need to take out our triangular shaped pieces to reduce the bulk when it all folds through to the right side. So you can see on the other end, I've used the pinking shears. Again, this would depend on your fabric type. So once you've trimmed all the way across, and you can layer your seam allowances where it straightens out, then you would turn through and press. Then that is your collar constructed and ready for attach to the garment. This extra seam allowance you have here on the stand is what is used to attach your collar to the garment, keeping the inside stand of the collar out of the way. We will just attach it on the outside collar. Then we will top stitch or sink stitch depending on your preference. You can see this one here has been top stitched, and then it catches the under collar in place, securing it onto your garment, and all the raw edges are enclosed inside. So the neck of the garment is sandwiched in between these two layers, and all raw edges are hidden. So that's the basic construction of your shirt collar and your pattern drafting.